All right, ladies and gents, this is topic number 5, and we are going to speak about medieval towns. First, we will cover their founding, how they were founded, and of course, their everyday problems, everyday life, and the different privileges of towns, which is a major topic here. And of course, medieval crafts, because industry was born in the medieval towns, and the guilds. And there are some extras that can be connected to this topic. So let's start. In the background, you see a medieval town. And of course, these features we are going to speak about, like look at the walls there and the narrow streets and such. But I am going into details very soon. So first of all, towns were first founded in Western Europe. So first in the 10th, 13th century, the biggest settlements that could be called towns were founded there, and about 4,000 or 5,000 people, or even 10,000, 15,000 people could live in a town, in the biggest towns. It is incomparable to ancient times. For example, in ancient Rome, there were 1 million people, but of course in the Middle Ages it was impossible. Of course, the growing of the population and the appearance of crafts made it possible to found the first towns. These towns were founded always by really wealthy people. So church dignitaries or monarchs, so kings or queens, founded these towns because they had the money to create them. Towns were very good business for the owner. They were great income because they could tax the towns. Huge amount of money was paid by the towns, and in return the owners, the church people and the monarchs, gave privileges to these towns, and these privileges sometimes these towns had to fight for, and sometimes these privileges were granted. So where were the first towns? Well, at trade routes, of course, road links where important trade routes met, or by riversides or seaports, because that is where the traders could meet, or around royal castles. Royal castles were perfect places for towns because these castles were always center of life. And of course, next to mines, because mining was always royal privilege, so the king's income concentrated next to mines. Nice example is Paris and Bologna, but in this map you see that in medieval Europe in the 1300s, the smallest and biggest towns. As you see, this is the population of the towns. Where are the centers? In Western Europe, of course in England there are some, and in the territory of France, in German territories, but look at North Italy. During the time of Renaissance, this is why Renaissance came from here, from North Italy, because of this vivid town life. Going on, we have to go to different types of towns. Of course, royal town or free town are said to be the most valuable, because these towns were linked to the king and they were given the best privileges. Mining town also, I told why. Market town can be imagined as growing villages linked together. So these were formed from villages mostly, and these towns had their most important privilege, that they could hold a market. In Hungarian we call them mezőváros. Okay, bányaváros és szabad királyi város. Going on, we have to speak about everyday life and townspeople. Those people who live in towns in the Middle Ages are called townspeople or burghers. Both words can be used and must be recognized. Towns had a free status, and of course this is why people in the towns had a free status, so they were not serfs. They belonged to the middle class, which was a very small class in the Middle Ages. It was a separate social layer. They were not noblemen, they were not serfs, somewhere in between. The town society had two major parts. There were the patricians, they were the leaders of the town, they were rich people, leader layer. Who are they? They are rich traders or masters of guilds, so they were craftsmen. They were the leaders who could be political figures, of course. They were members of the Senate who decided everything about the town. There was the lower layer, we call them plebs or plebeians. They had no real rights. They were just living in the city, in the town, so they were the townspeople. This was the majority of the town. Some of them were really poor, some of them were, uh, they had good living, but they were normal people. Towns could have a leader, the mayor, and of course, towns could defend themselves with city walls, but in everyday life, narrow streets in the cities made it really problematic if we think of hygiene, because there was no sanitation, really dirty streets, and epidemics uh, could spread easily. So life in a medieval town was not easy. Uh, People had to think of sanitation and hygienic conditions, but it was really hard in the Middle Ages. And we could also write here crowded. Yes, these towns were crowded in the Middle Ages. If you look at this picture, it's of course in Hungarian, but it shows you that this is the plebeian people, the plebs, and of course the patricians, who are rich traders and craftsmen, and they had the right only to be members of the city council or senate, and they could uh, choose the mayor or the city judge. There are also some privileges written around. I'm going to go into details in the privileges. So this is how medieval town looked like. Going on, town privileges. This is very important. The towns had absolutely different rights than a village. It was these privileges were collected in the town charter. This is a document. Of course, it was always signed and sealed by the king, and of course, this gave autonomy to the towns, a lot of freedom. Privileges taken by sword or both. Of course, sometimes they fought for it, sometimes they were granted these privileges. For example, right to hold markets, number one. Why? Because this is the income of the city. This is how they are going to pay taxes. The bigger cities had staple right, the right to stop goods. So if a trader goes through to town or city, they have the right, I mean the city people, the townspeople had the right to stop the trader and force him to sell the products there. This was not very welcome by a lot of traders, but this was an important right. If you have staple right, you have a big market. Cities were custom-free places, duty-free, so they could absolutely manipulate prices. The right of immunity. Many towns had right that if you are a serf or a lower layer person and you flee to a town and you stay there for a year and a day, you get freedom and you will not be a serf anymore. This is why it was often said, town air makes you free. Annual taxation to owner. Of course, if they had an agreement how much the next year tax would be, they could pay it in one amount and then it was over. This was an important privilege, much better than the status of a village. Right of jurisdiction, of course, they could choose their own judge. The right of administration, they could choose their administration staff. They self-government themselves, so the cities were quite autonomous. This means autonomy means that they have their self government. The right to choose a priest, of course, and they could choose the mayor. It's not written here, it was written before. And of course, defense, city walls were built to defend themselves. These are the most important privileges. There might be others, but if you remember most of these, that's okay. So this is everyday life. Let's go into details in connection with crafts. Medieval crafts were founded, of course, they wanted to defend the interests of the professions. There were several professions, shoemakers, carpenters, whatever, and these professions had masters. They worked in the town and they founded these guilds, in Hungarian céhek. So the guilds controlled everything connected to the profession. Prices, how many masters can there be, the quality of goods, how many goods can be made weekly or monthly. And they also hunted those people who were out of the guild, bunglers. We call them kontárok in Hungarian. These people were not professional workers, so they just sold their products unofficially, so they were hunted in the town. This was the whole thing, was to defend the masters. How to become a master? It was a long process. First, they were apprentice. Apprentice, segéd, inas. They were there uh, with the master from their childhood, and for 3 or 12 years they didn't get salary. They just got food and accommodation, and they worked and they learned everything from the master. Then they traveled very often a whole year somewhere abroad or another master in another city, and they learned their skills as well. And then they returned home and created a masterpiece. And when the masterpiece was accepted by the guild's masters, then this apprentice became a master and could open a workshop, because workshops are where masters worked. So these guilds were separated in town. They had different quarters, and they used their signs on their shops, workshops, that you could see it in the streets that, okay, there is a shoemaker's shop. And of course, sometimes they had their own duties in the town. For example, in Buda Castle, if you go to Fisherman's Bastion, Halászbástya, that is named because there was a bastion in the Middle Ages which was always defended by the Fishermen's Guild. So they had their duties. In the next picture, this helps you understanding better how the market of the town and the guild is working. They control everything, as you see, and they balance everything in the profession, and everything is because the well-being of the masters. Sorry. So here is mesterek jóléte. And this picture shows you how a ready master created his masterpiece, which is examined here by masters. And now maybe this young person can open his workshop. I think that's all. Extras. Let's go into extras. Well, industry technology developed because of towns. They started to use water power in the Middle Ages. This was a new technology. The first mills were created. I cannot connect it to any kind of profession, because not everyone used mills, but for crops grinding, smiths, fan forge, or textile craft, they started using mills. This was actually the most modern technology at that time. Windmills were also invented. And the last topic I would like to add here is the trade, because these towns connected trade routes. Please remember the Levant and the Hanseatic trade. It will be easier like that. In Europe, land trade, going on the land, was not very safe until the 14th century. So most importantly, the trade routes were connected with the sea. In the North Sea, the blue one is the Hanseatic trade, and in the Mediterranean Sea, we call it the Levant trade. So, for example, Genova, Venice were Levant traders, and they changed their products here. While in the north, Hamburg, Bruges, Ghent, they were Hanseatic traders who changed their products. Some were here, also Eastern products, but some difference. And the two important trade routes were connected with the Champagne trade route in the territory of France and German territories. And of course, this was a really uh, developed territory with a lot of nice cities because they could trade the best. As time passed, in the 13th, 14th century, land trade routes developed, and even through Hungary during the time of Charles Robert, very nice trade routes went through, but that was protected by the kings. And when safety was okay, then it means that trade developed. Okay, so this is all you have to know about medieval towns. Topic 5.